My Lords, it's very useful, I think, to have the Right Reverend Prelate raising a religious voice against these amendments, or raising some concerns, and maybe I could raise a non-religious voice of some concerns that I share against these amendments. I'm worried particularly about Amendments 53 and 57, and the idea of alternative assemblies directed towards furthering the spiritual, moral and social cultural education of pupils, I fear would just become a kind of secular version of religion, with all its preaching and things that I don't particularly like. I thought it was interesting that the noble Baroness Meacher mentioned what's happening in Wales, where I'm from, and I met some teachers from Wales over the weekend, and one of them talked about how apparently the alternative to religion is that we teach environmentalism, the new religion, and made that joke. But I think you would have to say, what would the content of these things be? So that's one point. But I also think that whilst I'm not religious, and I consider myself a humanist, I feel queasy as much as anything, because I think that what we have got a problem of in this country is religious illiteracy. I think that we want a secular society that understands religion and shows some regard for religion and its traditions. And religion certainly does seep into the public sphere, and a lack of religious literacy can be problematic. So we've only seen in the last week the issue around the Queen of Heaven film, which a major cinema chain, in fact several, have backed off from showing a really disgraceful incident of artistic censorship. And I noted that the reason for doing that was given that it was offensive to local Muslims. But in fact, the film was made by a Muslim filmmaker. And so I think that, you know, at the very least, one could say that that would just indicate that people panic in the face of religion without necessarily understanding it. I think it's this religious illiteracy that perhaps is why I have a preference, if I had to choose between them, for Amendments 54 and 56, because I think there is some attractive points made here. I think that religious and worldviews education sounds more palatable. If anything, I'd say why not for everyone. The amendment mentions non-religious philosophical convictions to be taught, but actually I think that all pupils would maybe benefit from, including those of a religious faith. I'd rather like every pupil to read John Locke's Letter on Toleration and understand the philosophical roots and importance of religious freedom for a secular society, ironically, and also to read J.S. Mill on liberty, which might counter, for example, the shocking events that we saw in Backley, where a religious education teacher is still in hiding for his life for the allegation of blaspheming, despite the fact there's no blasphemy law, and which actually people seem to feel very queasy about calling out or saying anything about in this House or in politics more generally. I was glad to see, by the way, in Amendments 54 and 56, an acknowledgement that Christianity is the predominant religion in Great Britain, because I think people have got a bit queasy about saying that for some reason. I think that that's important, that Christian tradition, to understand, doesn't just inform faith or even a moral framework for the country, but actually has provided centuries of cultural imagery and so on in art and literature. I remember when, as an English teacher, standing in front of a group of A-level students and saying, what might that apple symbolise? And I was just met with blank faces, where they couldn't understand what I meant. The apple didn't symbolise anything to them. And I don't think it was entirely my poor teaching that did that. I mean, it was kind of, when I explained it, it took quite a lot to get there, because they were unfamiliar. And so I think that I would like to see a greater understanding of the traditions, the history, the philosophy of religion, if anything. And then just finally, I worry, I suppose, about some of the kind of comments that were made that assumed that people of faith, or introducing pupils to faith, or within faith schools, for example, equals indoctrination. I think that's the wrong way to see it. I was brought up in a Catholic school, I mean, it backfired on them terribly, but it made me think. I don't think that people are just indoctrinated in that way. I also think it's wrong to associate religion with extremism per se, or to imagine the problems of political extremism that we might see in society are to do with religion. Goodness knows there's plenty of secular extremism about. And I also think we should be concerned about a mood of intolerance of Christianity, or even a squeamishness about people feeling that they are embarrassed by Christianity in this country. I don't think that's particularly helpful. So although I have some sympathy with two sets of the amendments rather than the others, I think that we should just be careful not to demonise religion or religious people or faith in a sense in our aspiration to widen and give more options for non-religious families.
Before the noble Baroness sits down, may I reassure her that amendments 53 and 57 apply to children who have already opted out of the religious worship, as is perfectly legal and has been the custom for some time. And is she reassured by the fact that I would have thought it highly likely that John Locke and John Stuart Mill would be taught as part of a moral and ethical basis in any decent education?
I wish I'm familiar with what's happening in education at the moment, and John Locke and J.S. Mill are nowhere near it. I'm suggesting that if they were, they should be taught to everyone. That was my point. I think opting out is fine, and that's, you know, we're going to go on in other amendments to talk about parents opting out of different things. That's fine. I just was worried about secular assemblies. I mean, that's the thing that filled me with horror, and I just thought that maybe they could go and listen to some classical music or something. It would be more productive. That was my concern on that one.